The air inside the National Archives in Washington, D.C., on that sweltering July afternoon of 1937, carried the thick, familiar scent of aged paper. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the high, arched windows, catching Arthur Albright's attention as he sat hunched over a desk. That smell was one he knew intimately, a comforting, scholarly aroma that spoke of forgotten histories and untold truths. Arthur, a man defined by meticulous habits and an almost obsessive devotion to historical records, ran a gloved hand along the spine of a leather-bound ledger. His spectacles teetered precariously on his nose, reflecting the dim glow of the reading lamp. For weeks he had been engrossed in cross-referencing the 1890 census with later state and federal records, a task most would consider mind-numbingly dull. But to Arthur, it was a hunt, the thrill of an archaeologist unearthing a lost civilization. He sifted through box after box of microfilm schedules, meticulously comparing names, addresses, occupations, and family structures. Amid the overwhelming mass of data, he found satisfaction in connecting the lives of individuals across decades, believing each name represented a life that deserved recognition in America's grand historical tapestry. It was on a particularly humid Tuesday, when the air felt thick and unyielding, that Arthur stumbled upon something extraordinary. Tucked away in a box labeled Miscellaneous Western Territories, Unprocessed, he found a bundle of census schedules tied with a brittle, faded ribbon. By 1890, most territories had standardized protocols. This box was an anomaly. Carefully, he untied the ribbon, the papers crackling softly. The first pages were ordinary, detailing scattered homesteads in what would become Wyoming and Montana. Johnson, Peterson, Smith, familiar and unremarkable. But as he turned a page, Arthur's heartbeat quickened. The entries that followed were different. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and distinct. The location was listed as Havenwood Settlement, Unorganized Territory, Wyoming-Montana border. Havenwood? Arthur's years studying frontier geography and shifting territorial lines yielded no reference. He consulted atlases, gazetteers, and territorial maps. Nothing. No record, no survey, no trace of this place. It was as if the town had been deliberately erased. At first, he considered it a temporary camp or vanished mining settlement. Yet the details unsettled him. The schedules were unusually thorough, listing not just names and ages, but also health status, dates of arrival, and a peculiar column labeled Observation Status, almost uniformly marked active or ongoing. The census recorded 214 individuals, men, women, and children, from infants to the elderly. Each entry included real names and vague occupations like community support or domestic duties. Caleb Miller, Ira Finch, Thomas Davies, Margaret Griggs, Samuel Sutter, William Bowen. Real people. But where were they? Arthur spent the afternoon cross-referencing every available record, 1890 census documents for surrounding counties, land deeds, homestead claims, birth and death certificates, even military records. Every search led to the same silence. These 214 individuals existed only on these forgotten pages. Their lives had been meticulously recorded, yet the official historical record treated them as though they had never existed. The mystery deepened, and with it, Arthur's obsession grew. This was not a missing town. It was 214 lives deliberately erased from history. The question gnawed at him. Who had recorded them? And why had the schedules been relegated to a dusty, unprocessed box for nearly 50 years? Arthur's next step was to investigate the enumerator. The handwriting was distinct, with an elegant capital H and artistic loops in the G's, refined unlike the rough scrawl typical of frontier records. After days of comparison, he found a match, a small box of personal effects from deceased federal employees. Inside was a worn leather journal belonging to Elias Thorne, Census Bureau, 1890 to 1895. Elias Thorne's entries revealed a young, idealistic enumerator who believed deeply in civic duty. His early work was typical, recording towns, farms, and ranches with meticulous care. Then, in early 1890, he received a special assignment from the newly formed Department of Public Health Initiatives to enumerate a highly isolated settlement in the unorganized territories along the Wyoming-Montana border. The task was secretive, delicate, and unprecedented. Thorne's optimism and dedication were palpable, yet Arthur could sense the unease creeping into his journal entries. Cross-referencing Elias's federal employment records, Arthur discovered that Thorne resigned abruptly in 1895, citing health reasons, with no further trace of him in any official capacity. It seemed that the enumerator himself had been partially erased, perhaps silenced by what he had witnessed. Arthur consulted colleagues, including Dr. Eleanor Vance, a senior archivist specializing in demographic shifts. "A settlement of over 200 people completely unrecorded elsewhere?" she said, brow furrowed. "It defies logic. Are you certain it isn't a misfiled document?" But Arthur knew better. He had uncovered a deliberate historical erasure, a void in the official narrative where 214 lives had once existed. And now, armed with the journal, the census schedules, and his own determination, he felt an urgent duty to restore Havenwood and its people to history, to give them back the existence that had been stolen. Perhaps a temporary camp that disbanded before official recognition. Arthur shook his head. "I've checked every possible avenue. Eleanor land claims, postal routes, even railroad expansion surveys. Nothing. And the observation status column, it's not standard census procedure. It suggests something else entirely." He showed her the journal entries. Elias's growing unease palpable even across the decades. Eleanor's skepticism began to waver, replaced by a look of dawning concern. "This Department of Public Health Initiatives, I don't recall any such federal body existing in 1890 with the authority to establish secret settlements." The Public Health Service was still in its infancy, focused on ports and quarantines, not internal communities. The more Arthur delved, the clearer it became. This was no mere administrative error. This was a deliberate act of omission, a carefully orchestrated disappearance. The names on the Havenwood schedules were not just forgotten, they had been made to be forgotten. And Elias Thorne, the diligent enumerator, was the only one who had dared to record their existence. Arthur felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The implications were vast, terrifying. What kind of public health situation would necessitate the complete erasure of an entire community? He knew he had to follow Elias Thorne's journey to understand what he had seen and why he had gone to such lengths to preserve the truth. The journal, now his most prized possession, became his guide, a fragile bridge across time to a forgotten horror. Elias Thorne, a man whose earnestness was as boundless as the western sky, set out from Cheyenne in the spring of 1890. His journey was a testament to the rugged individualism and relentless spirit of the era, yet it was also tinged with an unusual sense of foreboding. The instructions he carried were vague, almost deliberately so, directing him to a remote corner of the unorganized territory, a place marked only by a crude X on a hand-drawn map provided by the Public Health Initiatives Office. The official maps, he noted, showed nothing but an expanse of untouched wilderness. His initial days were spent traversing the familiar, if challenging, landscapes of Wyoming. The vast plains stretched out, interrupted by the occasional rise of foothills, the air crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush, and distant pine. He rode a sturdy mare packed with his census forms, a change of clothes, basic provisions, and a trusty rifle. He passed through nayant towns, their wooden fashions still raw against the elements, and encountered solitary homesteaders carving out lives from the unforgiving land. These interactions were always cordial, often ending with a shared meal and stories exchanged by the flickering light of a campfire. But as he ventured further north and west, deeper into the territory, where the maps grew sparse and the trails faded into game paths, the atmosphere began to shift. The conversations were. The few trappers and traders he encountered grew shorter, their eyes darting nervously when he mentioned his destination. "Havenwood, you say?" An old fur trapper with a weather-beaten face grunted, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Never heard of it, and if I had, I reckon I'd forget it quick." He then turned his back, refusing further conversation. Another time, at a dilapidated trading post, the proprietor, a gaunt man with a perpetual tremor in his hands, grew pale when Elias inquired about the settlement. "Best not to go looking for what ain't meant to be found, son," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Some places they just ain't on God's good earth." He then busied himself with rearranging dusty tins, his back to Elias, effectively ending the discussion. The silence that followed these encounters was more unsettling than any direct warning. It was a silence heavy with unspoken fears, with the weight of local legends and hushed rumors. Elias, a man of logic and reason, tried to dismiss these reactions as frontier superstition, the natural caution of those living on the fringes of civilization. Yet the cumulative effect was undeniable. A seed of unease had been planted, and it began to sprout with each mile he traveled. The landscape itself seemed to conspire with the growing dread. The vibrant greens of the plains gave way to a more muted palette of greys and browns, the trees becoming sparser, their branches gnarled and twisted as if in perpetual agony. The air grew still, the usual sounds of wildlife, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote seemed to diminish, replaced by an unnatural quiet, he noted in his journal. "The land here feels held as if it is waiting for something, or perhaps holding its breath. The silence is profound, unlike any I have experienced. Even the wind seems to whisper rather than roar." He found himself constantly scanning horizon, not for danger, but for an explanation, a sign that would dispel the growing sense of wrongness. After weeks of arduous travel, navigating through increasingly dense pine forests and over rocky, unforgiving terrain, Elias finally reached a high ridge. Below him, nestled in a secluded valley, was Havenwood. It wasn't a sprawling town, but a cluster of buildings, perhaps 20 or so, arranged in a neat, almost geometric pattern around a central, larger structure. A tall, sturdy fence made of thick timber surrounded the entire settlement, its presence stark and imposing against the natural backdrop. It wasn't a stockade, but it certainly wasn't a typical ranch fence either. It looked more like a barrier. No smoke rose from the chimneys despite the cool mountain air. No children played in the dusty lanes. No livestock grazed in pastures. The settlement was eerily still, a silent tableau bathed in the late afternoon sun. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, the warnings of the trappers, the hushed tones of the traders, the unnatural silence of the wilderness. It all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. This was not a normal place. His senses' forms, once symbols of order and inclusion, now felt like a flimsy shield against an unknown darkness. He took a deep breath, adjusted his hat, and began his descent into the valley, his heart heavy with a premonition he couldn't shake. If you're finding yourself on the edge of your seat, wondering what Elias will discover, don't forget to leave a comment below with your theories. We love hearing from you. The descent into Havenwood Valley was like stepping into a different world, a pocket of unnatural stillness carved out of the rugged frontier. As Elias drew closer, the details of the settlement became starkly clear. The buildings were uniformly constructed. Simple wooden structures, painted a dull, faded gray, arranged in precise rows. There was a central larger building that appeared to be a communal hall or administrative office, and another slightly smaller, with a distinctive, almost clinical cleanliness to its exterior, perhaps a dispensary or infirmary. The timber fence, which from a distance had seemed merely robust, now revealed itself to be formidable, topped with a single strand of barbed wire, a detail Elias found deeply unsettling. The oppressive silence was the first thing that truly struck him. No barking dogs, no crowing roosters, no distant shouts of children at play. Even the wind, which had been a constant companion on his journey, seemed to die down as he entered the valley, leaving only a profound, almost suffocating quiet. And then there was the smell, a faint, metallic sweet odor, subtle at first, but growing stronger as he approached the main gate. It was an unfamiliar scent, yet it carried an unsettling undertone, like old blood mixed with something medicinal and cloying. As he dismounted at the gate, a figure emerged from the central building. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a lean frame and a face etched with countless lines, like a map of sorrow. His eyes, however, were what truly captured Elias's attention. A startling pale blue, set deep in their sockets, and holding a weariness that seemed to predate his years. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his movements were slow, deliberate, as if conserving every ounce of energy. "Good afternoon," Elias offered, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "My name is Elias Thorne. I'm with the United States Census Bureau. I'm here to enumerate the residents of Havenwood Settlement." The old man regarded him with those pale eyes, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "We've been expecting you, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice soft, raspy, yet carrying an unexpected authority. "I am Caleb Miller, the elder of this community. Welcome to Havenwood." He gestured towards the gate, which to Elias's surprise was unlocked. As Elias led his mare through, he noticed two other figures, younger men, standing silently by one of the grey buildings. They were dressed in simple dark clothing, and each carried a rifle held casually but purposefully. They watched him with the same unnerving stillness as Caleb Miller, their faces equally pale and devoid of expression. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. These were not typical frontier guards. Caleb led him to a small, sparsely furnished cabin. "You'll stay here," he said. "We have little to offer in the way of comfort, but it is clean." He then sat on a wooden stool, his gaze fixed on Elias. "You wish to know about us, Mr. Thorne? Our names? Our ages? Our stories?" Elias nodded, opening his satchel and retrieving his census forms. "That is my duty, Mr. Miller, to ensure every American is counted." Caleb let out a soft, dry chuckle that held no humor. "Counted, yes, but for what purpose, I wonder?" He then began to speak, his voice a low monotone, recounting the community's history. He spoke of how 3 years prior they had been recruited from various struggling communities across the Midwest. Farmers whose land had failed, miners whose veins had run dry, families displaced by economic hardship. They had been promised a new life, a fresh start in a fertile valley, free land, and a supportive community, all under the benevolent guidance of a special government initiative focused on health and well-being. "They told us it was a chance to build something new," Caleb explained, his eyes distant. "A place where we could escape the diseases of the crowded cities, where our children could grow strong and healthy, free from consumption that plagued so many. They promised a doctor, resources, a future." He paused, a deep sigh escaping his lips, and we, desperate and hopeful, believed them. Elias listened, his pen poised over the paper. He asked about their journey, the promises made, the initial days in Havenwood. Caleb described a carefully orchestrated relocation, trains and covered wagons, all managed by stern uniformed men. Upon arrival, they were told the settlement was a controlled environment for a long-term health study, and they were to remain within the fence for their own protection and for the integrity of the study. As Caleb spoke, Elias observed the other residents. They moved about their daily tasks with a quiet resignation, their faces uniformly pale, their eyes often downcast. He saw children, thin and listless, playing without laughter, their movements slow and deliberate. The metallic sweet smell seemed to cling to everything, a constant subtle reminder of something unseen and pervasive. Later that evening, as Elias began his enumeration, he met Ara Finch, a former schoolteacher from Ohio. She was a woman of quiet dignity, her once bright eyes now shadowed with a profound sadness. They promised us education, a library, a chance to teach again, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Instead, I teach the children what I can, but their minds, they are not as sharp as they once were. The sickness, you see, it takes more than just the body. She spoke of a persistent cough that afflicted many, a gradual wasting away that seemed to touch everyone in Havenwood. He spoke with Thomas Davies, a burly man who had once worked the coal mines of Pennsylvania. Thomas's frame was still powerful, but his skin was a sickly gray, and his breath came in shallow gasps. They said this valley had clean air, that it would cure the black lung. He rasped, a bitter laugh escaping him. Inns. Ted. It just waits. We all wait. Samuel Sutter, a farmer from Kansas, spoke of the fertile land they were promised. The soil here is rich, Mr. Thorne, he said, gesturing vaguely towards the fields beyond the cabins. But the crops, they don't thrive. They grow weak, just like us. And the water, it has a strange taste. Margaret Griggs, a young mother, held her infant son, William Bowen, close. The baby was unnaturally quiet, his skin almost translucent. Margaret's eyes were wide with a silent plea. They said the doctor would make us well, she whispered, tears welling. But he only watches. He only writes in his books. It was then that Elias saw him, a man in a crisp white coat, emerging from the pristine medical facility. He was tall, with a severe, intelligent face, and cold, piercing eyes. This was Dr. Alistair Hlicks, the government physician, the architect of Havenwood. He moved with an air of detached authority, observing the residents with a clinical gaze that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. The doctor nodded curtly at Elias, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than a greeting. As Elias continued to record names, ages, and the vague occupations, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming a picture far more sinister than he could have imagined. The unique public health situation was not a cure, but a confinement. The health study was not about healing, but about observation. The fence, the guards, the pervasive pallor, the metallic sweet smell, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The residents of Havenwood were not patients. They were specimens. And Elias Thorne, the diligent census enumerator, had just walked into a living tomb. Elias Thorne, armed with his census forms and a growing sense of dread, continued his enumeration. But his mission had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer merely counting people. He was documenting a crime. Each interview became an act of quiet rebellion, a desperate attempt to gather evidence to give voice to those who were being systematically silenced. He meticulously recorded every detail, not just the required census data, but also the subtle nuances of their stories, the unspoken fears in their eyes, the physical manifestations of their suffering. He learned that the tuberculosis study was a cruel deception. The residents had been told they were susceptible to a new aggressive strain of consumption, and that Havenwood was a specialized sanatorium, a place where they would receive cutting-edge treatment in a pristine environment. The reality was a stark, horrifying contrast. No treatment was ever administered. Instead, Dr. Hyrix and his small team of assistants meticulously documented the progression of the disease. They measured lung capacity, recorded cough frequency, charted weight loss, and noted the increasing power of the skin. They were not healers. They were observers, their instruments cold and precise, their gazes devoid of empathy. Ah Finch, her voice a fragile whisper, described the daily examinations. They listen to our chests, Mr. Thorne, with cold metal. They take samples of our breath, our blood. They ask us how we feel, but they never offer a remedy. Only more questions, always more questions. She spoke of the children, their small bodies wasting away, their once bright eyes growing dull and distant. They promised us a healthy future, she repeated, her voice breaking. They promised us life. Thomas Davies, his breath now a constant struggle, confided in Elias about the special tonic they were given. "It tastes of nothing, Mr. Thorne," he rasped, "and it does nothing. It is water, I think, or worse, something to keep us compliant." He spoke of the guards, the same silent men Elias had seen upon arrival, who patrolled the perimeter and ensured no one strayed from their assigned areas. "They are not here to protect us," Thomas said, a bitter cough racking his frame. "They are here to keep us in," Samuel Sutter, the farmer, revealed a chilling detail. "The doctor, he sometimes speaks of control groups and variables," he muttered, his eyes darting nervously towards the medical facility. "He says, our sacrifice will benefit mankind. But what kind of benefit comes from watching people die slowly?" Elias's horror deepened with each confession. He tried to engage Dr. Hicks in conversation, feigning a professional interest in the study. The doctor, a man of chilling composure, spoke in clinical terms, his voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Thorne, this is a groundbreaking initiative," Harris explained, gesturing vaguely towards the pale residents. "We are observing the natural progression of a highly virulent pulmonary affliction in a controlled, isolated environment. The data we are collecting will be invaluable in understanding its etiology and potential future containment strategies. Sentimentality, I assure you, has no place in pure scientific inquiry." When Elias cautiously inquired about treatment, Fricks's eyes narrowed slightly. "Treatment, Mr. Thorne, would contaminate the data. Our objective is observation, not intervention. These individuals, by their very presence here, are contributing to a greater good." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. Elias realized then that Harrix saw these people not as human beings, but as living experiments, their suffering merely data points in a macabre ledger. Elias's internal conflict raged. He was a federal employee, sworn to uphold the law. But what he was witnessing was a profound violation of every moral and ethical principle he held dear. He knew he couldn't openly challenge Ricks. The doctor's authority, backed by the armed guards, and the impenetrable fence was absolute within Havenwood. His only recourse was to continue his enumeration, to document the truth in a way that could not be easily dismissed. He began to embed hidden messages within his census notes. In the remarks section where he was supposed to note minor observations, he wrote cryptic phrases. Next to Ara Finch's name, he noted, "Subject expresses profound despair regarding promised education and children's health decline." For Thomas Davies, "Subject exhibits severe respiratory distress, questions tonic efficacy." For Margaret Griggs and William Bowen, "Infant shows extreme pallor, listlessness." Mother, expresses fear of doctor's observation. He hoped that if these documents ever saw the light of day, someone someday would understand the true meaning behind his seemingly innocuous remarks. One evening, while Herix was occupied in his laboratory, Elias managed to slip away and approach the medical facility. The building, though pristine, exuded a chilling aura. He tried the door to the records room, finding it, as expected, locked. But through a small, grimy window he glimpsed stacks of ledgers, charts, and what looked like personal effects. He knew the full story. The true nature of the study lay behind that locked door. The residents, sensing his quiet defiance, began to whisper more freely. Stories of those who had tried to leave, who had attempted to scale the fence or sneak past the guards. They just disappeared, Mr. Thorne, Caleb Miller confided, his voice barely audible. No one ever saw them again. The doctor would simply announce they had been relocated for advanced treatment. But we always knew. The fence, Elias now understood, was not just a barrier, it was a tombstone. The realization solidified Elias's resolve. He would complete his census, every name, every detail, no matter the risk. He would ensure that these 214 souls, condemned to a slow, observed death, would not be erased from history without a fight. His pen, once a tool of bureaucracy, had become a weapon of truth. If the chilling implications of Havenwood are making your skin crawl, please take a moment to share this video with someone who appreciates a good historical mystery. Let's spread the word about these forgotten stories. The tension in Havenwood was a palpable thing, a heavy shroud that settled over the settlement. Dr. Hrix, with his cold, calculating gaze, had begun to notice Elias Thorne's meticulousness, his unusual depth of inquiry. It was not the prejuncta tabulation expected of a census enumerator. Elias's questions were too pointed, his observations too keen. One afternoon, as Elias was concluding an interview with a frail elderly woman, Hrix appeared, his presence a sudden, chilling shadow. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I understand you've been quite thorough in your duties." There was no warmth in his tone, only a veiled threat. "However, I must remind you of the sensitive nature of this facility. Our residents are delicate, and excessive questioning can be counterproductive to their well-being." Elias met his gaze, feigning an air of innocent diligence. "Of course, Doctor. I merely wish to ensure the most accurate possible record. The Bureau prides itself on its comprehensive data collection." He held up his census forms filled with names and numbers, and unbeknownst to Hrix, his carefully coded observations. Hrix stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Indeed, but some details, Mr. Thorne, are best left unrecorded. For the sake of national security, and for the integrity of this vital public health initiative, certain anomalies must be overlooked. You understand? And I trust." The implication was clear. Elias was to ignore the true nature of Havenwood, to sanitize his report, or face severe consequences. Elias felt a surge of fear, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I understand the importance of discretion, Doctor," he replied, his voice steady. "My report will reflect the official narrative, of course. However, my personal notes for the Bureau's internal records must be complete. It is a matter of professional integrity." He knew he was treading a dangerous line, but he couldn't back down. He had to protect his true documentation. Hendrik studied him for a long moment, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Professional integrity is commendable, Mr. Thorne, but so is loyalty and silence." He then turned and walked away, leaving Elias with a chilling certainty that he was now under direct suspicion. The remaining days in Havenwood were a blur of quiet desperation. Elias worked quickly, completing the last of his interviews, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was likely the last outsider these people would ever see. He spoke with Caleb Miller one final time under the cover of dusk. "I have recorded every name, Mr. Miller," Elias whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Every single one. They will not be forgotten." Caleb's pale eyes, filled with an ancient sorrow, met his. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," he rasped, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "We knew we were being erased. To be counted, to be acknowledged. It means more than you can know. Just remember us. Remember Havenwood. Tell them we were here." The next morning, Elias was informed by one of the armed guards that his enumeration was complete and arrangements had been made for his departure. He was escorted to the gate, his satchel containing the precious census schedules and his journal clutched tightly in his hand. As he mounted his mare, he turned for one last look at Havenwood. The residents stood at their cabin windows, pale faces pressed against the glass, watching him leave. Caleb Miller stood by, the central building, a solitary stoic figure, his hand raised in a silent, mournful farewell. The image was seared into Elias's memory, a haunting tableau of quiet suffering. The journey back was fraught with anxiety. Elias constantly looked over his shoulder, convinced he was being followed. He rode hard, taking circuitous routes, avoiding main trails, his mind racing. What would he do with the census? How could he expose the truth without endangering himself and, more importantly, without allowing the government to simply destroy the evidence? Upon his arrival at the Regional Census Bureau office in Cheyenne, he was met not with congratulations, but with a stern summons from a senior official, a Mr. Harrison. "Thorne," Harrison began, his face grim, "we've received a rather concerning report regarding your recent assignment. Dr. Hendries of the Public Health Initiatives has expressed dissatisfaction with your conduct. He claims you were overly intrusive, disruptive to their sensitive operations." Elias felt a cold dread. Hyrix had moved quickly. "Sir, I merely performed my duties as required," Elias stated, trying to keep his voice even. The settlement Havenwood was unusual. The residents were in poor health, and their living conditions were peculiar. Harrison slammed his fist on the desk. "Peculiar is not a word we use in official reports. Thorne, Dr. Hackris's project is of the utmost importance to national health. Your job was to count, not to investigate. Furthermore, your schedules for this Havenwood are problematic. There is no official record of such a settlement. It appears to be a clerical error, a misidentification on your part." Elias's blood ran cold. "Sir, I assure you, Havenwood exists. I was there. I enumerated 21 individuals." He pushed the census schedules across the desk. Harrison barely glanced at them. "These names, Thorne, do not appear in any other federal or territorial records. They are, for all intents and purposes, non-existent." Elias Thorne's hands trembled as he stared at the ledger before him. "But, sir," he whispered, "that would be a lie." "I cannot erase these people. They are real." Harrison leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "You will, Mr. Thorne, if you wish to retain your position, and perhaps your freedom. This is not a request. It is an order from the highest levels. The Department of Public Health Initiatives has considerable influence. Do you understand?" Elias understood perfectly. He was trapped. He could defy them, risk exposure, and fight for the truth, but he would be ruined, perhaps permanently silenced, and the evidence would vanish. Or he could comply outwardly, hiding the truth in plain sight. He looked over the census schedules he had meticulously recorded, the names, the details, the care he had taken to note every observation. He knew what had to be done. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice barely audible. "I understand. The schedules would be sanitized. The official report would claim the area was uninhabited. But Elias would not destroy the original records. He hid them, along with his journal, deep within the archives, leaving behind a trail for a future discoverer, someone meticulous enough to understand. Back in the quiet sanctity of the National Archives in 1937, Arthur Albright felt an almost spiritual connection to Elias Thorne as he read the journal. He traced the young enumerator's journey from idealistic enthusiasm to creeping unease, culminating in that terrifying confrontation with Harrison and the forced compliance. The journal and the hidden records revealed a man of integrity caught in the machinery of institutional power. Arthur now held the unredacted census schedules, complete with Elias's cryptic observations and the journal detailing the entire ordeal. Yet, the story was larger. The Department of Public Health Initiatives, a phantom organization, left almost no trace. By cross-referencing personnel and dates in Elias's journal, Arthur discovered obscure congressional appropriations bills from the late 1880s, allocating funds for experimental public health programs in remote territories. Oversight was minimal. Bureaucracy ran unchecked. He unearthed redacted correspondence between Dr. Alistair Herricks and high-ranking officials in the nascent public health service. The letters hinted at promising preliminary results from the secret experiments, emphasizing data collection and observation, but never mentioning patients or treatment. The language was cold, clinical and deliberate. Humans reduced to subjects, lives reduced to data points. A single brief government report from 1896 declared one of the experimental facilities decommissioned due to environmental factors. No residents were mentioned, no explanation given, only a sterile bureaucratic closure. Compelled to understand the full scope of the cover-up, Arthur left the archives, traveling into the remote regions described in Elias's entries. Guided by an old rancher, he found only overgrown ruins, foundations reclaimed by nature, faint traces of structures long vanished. Locals whispered of a place where strangers came, and then nothing. Never a trace of the people left behind. Arthur found relics, a rusted tin toy, fragments of household items, evidence that lives had once been here, erased from memory and official record alike. Back in Washington, Arthur catalogued his findings with painstaking care. He created an obscure classification code, cross-referencing it with innocuous documents, constructing a hidden archive within the archive. The original census schedules, Elias's journal, and the redacted government correspondence were secured in a fireproof container, placed in a remote section of the archives. Only someone meticulous enough, like himself or a future archivist, could ever hope to find it. Arthur reflected on the profound power of institutions to erase, to deny, and to rewrite history. The horror was not supernatural, it was bureaucratic, methodical, and terrifyingly plausible. Human ambition, cloaked in the guise of public health and scientific inquiry, had claimed lives and stripped them from the historical record. The evidence, however hidden, endured, safeguarded for the day someone might finally uncover the truth. Elias Thorne had carried the weight of these erased lives until his death in 1920, officially attributed to pulmonary complications. Arthur understood that the psychological toll of witnessing such erasure had likely shortened his life. The lesson was clear. Truth, no matter how inconvenient, must be preserved, even when the powers that be seek its annihilation. In the quiet rows of the National Archives, Arthur Albright continued his work. The undacted schedules, the hidden journal, and the redacted correspondence formed a silent testament to lives that had officially never existed. He never spoke of it, but the weight of responsibility remained. Some secrets, some histories, must wait patiently for those prepared to uncover them, guided by meticulous hands, unwavering integrity, and the belief that even when erased on paper, human lives should never be forgotten. And somewhere, in the dusty labyrinth of documents, the truth waits, an echo of the past, a whisper that defies official erasure, daring future generations